Hi, Mike.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
Doing great.
Good, good. You're in Washington?
Beautiful downtown D.C.
At the New America Foundation.
Which is celebrating its 14th or 15th anniversary, more or less.
And which, according to the jacket of your book, and we will get to your book in a moment, you are a co-founder.
Yes, it was all a twinkle in the eye of... originally,
who else? Who are the official co-founders?
Is Walter Russell Mead, Cheryl Schwinninger, Ted Halstead, and myself, and we dreamed it all up on Walter's couch in New York in 1997.
Wow.
And so here we are. Walter dropped out kind of early and joined the Council on Foreign Relations. He's at Bard now. But Cheryl Schwinninger and I are still here.
The Council on Foreign Relations, a young upstart rival of the New America Foundation.
That's right. If you've never heard of it before, it's a little think tank in New York.
Exactly. It's somewhere in Manhattan. But you're in Washington. Thanks for joining us. Let me tell people that I'm Robert Wright, and this is, in fact, The Wright Show. You are Michael Lind, author of Land of Promise, An Economic History of the United States, which has a beautiful Thomas Hart Benton painting on it. It is an economic history.
You should judge this book by its cover.
Well, that would certainly, I would say you win either way. If people judge it by its contents or by its cover, you're going to come out ahead. But it really is, I'm really a fan of his, and it's very nice. Although, interestingly, his name is not mentioned. Such is the way that copyright law impinges on publishers, that they are much more inclined to mention the museum in which the art is, and in giving credit, than the art itself.
Well, just between us, I had to pay to get permissions to reprint an Irving Berlin song, which he gave to the U.S. Treasury for free during World War II. So
really,
so copyright law is kind of complex.
Well, that's revenue for our government means, I think, less tax payments for me, so that's okay. So anyway, it is an economic history. A very rich one, but it is supposed to have relevance to the present and future world. In fact, that's kind of the point of the whole thing. If I can say a couple words about it before you take over, it focuses on this well-known distinction between the Jacksonian and Hamiltonian ideological traditions in America. The history is told largely through that lens. You have a clear favorite between those two, and that is, and it's that ideology that you think we should, I think, put our money on from here on out. I won't spoil the plot by telling them what your favorite is, although that'll become apparent soon enough. But for starters, I was going to ask, could you give us a good, roughly one-sentence definition of the Jacksonian and the Hamiltonian traditions?
Yes, the difference between the Hamiltonian tradition and the Jeffersonian tradition, of which I think...
Oh, did I say Jacksonian?
Yeah, I tend to count Jackson as a Jeffersonian. So the big traditions are the Hamiltonian and the Jeffersonian, and these correspond in more abstract terms to developmental capitalism and to producerist capitalism, which is a term many historians have used for the Jeffersonians. Developmentalism in the Hamiltonian tradition, like its equivalents in Europe and East Asia, sees the government as the partner of business, and in some cases of organized labor, not in all cases, in a common project of national economic industrial development. So the government is the coach of a team. The Jeffersonian tradition sees the purpose of the economy as benefiting small producers. They're not necessarily free marketeers. They want to use the government to protect the small businessman against the big businessman, the small banker against the big banker, and so on. So neither the Hamiltonian nor the Jeffersonian tradition necessarily objects to government intervention in the economy. They simply want the government to intervene to do two different things. The one is state-sponsored industrial development in the Hamiltonian case.
Is that a common misunderstanding? Because I would have thought of Jeffersonian as kind of the more free markety of the two, but you're saying that's the wrong way to think about it.
No, if you take off the Jefferson mask from modern libertarians, you find a Central European Austrian face underneath. So in the last generation, the Austrian school of von Mises and Hayek, the Chicago school. They've been very successful in pretending that their version of extreme libertarianism, which actually really does tend to have roots in early 20th century, late 19th century Central Europe, in Austria and Germany, goes all the way back to the American founding. It's been an excellent kind of a propaganda effort, but it's not the case. If you look at the Jeffersonians, they intervened in the market again and again, as I say, to protect small producers. So all the way up until the 1970s and 80s, we had laws at the state and federal level protecting unit banks. These were little mom and pop banks, basically, and they were protected against branch banking by big northeastern banks. That was a Jeffersonian measure. It's extremely interventionist in the economy. Antitrust, to the extent that it was interpreted as protecting small businesses from big businesses, that was another Jeffersonian intervention in the economy. And you can just go on and on. So, as I say, it's simply false to assume that the Jeffersonians believe in free markets and that the Hamiltonians are for big government. They both want government to intervene in the economy, but for different purposes.
Okay. And should we go ahead and spoil the plot and tell them which of these two traditions you favor?
Well, I defend the Hamiltonian tradition, partly because I'm a Southerner. I've seen what the Jeffersonian tradition did to my region of the country, which back in...
You mean going back to before the Civil War?
Yeah, back in 1861, my part of the country declared war on what was already the most advanced industrial region of Earth. And then having declared war, they suddenly realized they didn't have factories and enough railroads and enough bullets and, things like that, that you actually have to have an industrial base in order to be a great power. And so, unlike many of my fellow Southerners, I have reflected on this local history. There were always a number of us Southern Hamiltonians, and not to sound too pompous, but the number includes George Washington, Henry Clay, who was the major leader of the Hamiltonian tradition, a Kentuckian in the 19th century, another Kentuckian who was Henry Clay's disciple, Abraham Lincoln. So there was always a minority within the South which identified with this pro-industrial nation-building project against this more agrarian, producerist, Jeffersonian tradition in the South.
Okay.
But the reason I think it's quite apart from that, the reason I side with it is Jeffersonian producerism presupposed a pre-industrial agrarian society where you could actually approximate the agrarian republican ideal. That is, you wouldn't have a standing army. The independent yeoman farmers would take up their muskets, and form a militia during wartime. And that was a very inspiring idea, and particularly during the agrarian period, probably the most decent societies on earth in the millennia before the Industrial Revolution were some of these city-states, where you had a mostly agrarian economy and high level of personal independence. Okay. The thing is, once you have a factory-based, inorganic, energy-based civilization or mineral energy-based civilization, and you get a majority of workers freed from agriculture to be industrial or service sector wage workers, then the Jeffersonian goal, which is an admirable goal, that is, everyone is sort of a self-sufficient yeoman farmer, it just becomes irrelevant, and so Jeffersonian has been in crisis.
Okay, but let me ask
many
you,
generations.
Mike, if the Jeffersonian tradition is as you characterize it, then the choice we face now wouldn't really seem to be between Jeffersonian and Hamiltonian. I mean, it's right. It's not like either the Democrats or the Republicans are focusing entirely or largely on the plight of really small business people and small farmers, right? I mean, of course, they all say they're on the side of small business and so on. But if you look at the actual constituencies, I don't quite see how your definition of Jeffersonian applies to either party.
Well, it's never been the case that the Jeffersonians or the Hamiltonians, for that matter, necessarily represent the abstract public interest. Obviously, different groups favor these ideologies for their own purposes. If you go back to the 19th century, the 1830s, when Andrew Jackson was leading the Jacksonian Revolution against the leading Hamiltonian of his day, his opponent Henry Clay, Jackson, of course, was an extraordinarily rich slave owner. The social base for Jacksonianism, it wasn't necessarily the small free farmers. The backbone of Jacksonianism was the rich Southern planter elite, a plutocracy, and their allies were bankers, rich bankers in cities like New York and Boston, which wanted to destroy the second bank of the United States and get a share of its deposits, which Jackson passed out to so-called pet banks. So there's a long tradition where economic elites have used this kind of Jacksonian populist language for their own purposes. And you see this today where you have, the Club for Growth and essentially, using all of the stuff about small businesses and everyone can be a day trader. Their real constituents are the 1%, very, very wealthy people in the United States. Now, the Hamiltonians, in contrast, they've made no bones about being supportive of big business and big banking. Their philosophy has generally been what the Whig Party, an early incarnation of the Hamiltonian tradition in the antebellum period, called the harmony of interests. That is, it's not a natural harmony of interests. That is, it's not something that comes about if you just leave things alone, but it's the purpose of public policy to reconcile the interests of business and labor and farmers. So it's much more of a kind of, it's not a planned economy, but it's a kind of a managed system, which, again, the government is not simply the tool of any particular interest, but is kind of a coach, not just an umpire or a referee in an abstract game where you level the playing field and then you don't care about the results. Okay.
Now I think in your telling of history, you divide American history into kind of three sections, kind of three republics. And is it your contention that in all of these phases, the Hamiltonian tradition has demonstrated its superiority, or is that putting it too simply?
Well, I argue, following other historians, including Bruce Ackerman and the political scientist Theodore Lowy, that even though we pretend we're still living under the unchanged Constitution of 1787-89, the federal Constitution that's replaced the Articles of Confederation, that in fact we do have revolutions. We don't call them revolutions, but that's what they were. The Civil War was a revolution, created a de facto Second American Republic. The New Deal and World War II, if you put them together, it was essentially created a new regime. I think we're living in the last years of it now. I call it the Third Republic of the United States, essentially put together by Roosevelt and his modern Republican successors, including Eisenhower and Nixon. Now, if you follow this three republic or three regime theory, what you see is that during the early phase where you're constructing a new system, a new American system, to use Henry Clay's language, during one of these great crises like the Civil War and Reconstruction or the New Deal and World War II, the Hamiltonians tend to come to the fore. Simply because there are these great tasks to be done, and you need to get the government and big business leaders and small business and labor and other people. They just have to work together, rebuild the country. After a generation or so of this kind of heroic nation building, there's a backlash. The people are tired of it. There's a new generation rebelling against its elders, and at that point, you tend to get leaders like Andrew Jackson and William Jennings Bryan and Ronald Reagan. At the same stage in these three republics, saying, let's go back to this smaller, simpler, more Arcadian, more Jeffersonian past. We're tired of bigness. I think we're so far in this Jeffersonian backlash cycle now that began even with Jimmy Carter before Reagan, because remember, Carter portrayed himself as the rural Jeffersonian who was going to come save America from the corrupt big city political machines and modernity in a lot of ways.
He deregulated the airlines.
We're at such a stage now that big has become an insult. You simply attach big to anything.
But that's what I don't get. I mean, neither Reagan nor Carter was really anti-big business, were they? They were both somewhat anti-regulation. Certainly Carter was by the standards of the Democratic Party. He deregulated the airlines. But were they anti-big business?
Well, the rhetoric is anti-bigness. The practice is not. So, for example, if you look at the Reagan administration, it pretty much adopted the Chicago School's critique of antitrust. I have my own critique of antitrust in the book, which is somewhat different. So you're quite right. There's this gap between rhetoric and reality. If you look at the federal government's definition of what a small business is, for a lot of purposes, a small business is any business with fewer than 500 employees. And they get all of these small business tax breaks, which are justified on the basis that this is some kind of mom and pop sort of thing. So you're quite right. There's a big gap between. On the other hand, I do think it makes a difference, this ideology. So, for example, if you look at the way American telecommunications has evolved since the 1970s and 80s, compared to some other countries that don't have this Jeffersonian tradition, they simply appointed their national telephone companies to do the internet. And as a result, you have far superior monopolistic internet systems in East Asia and in Europe. In our country, we've tried to adopt a system which, granted, is more Chicago school than Jeffersonian, in which you have lots of different tiny incompatible systems forming a patchwork. So I do think the ideology makes a difference.
What are the incompatibilities here? You mean like between the two standards of wireless transmission that cell phone uses?
Yes, exactly. So, for example, some time ago I was in a national park, and I could not call my friend in the same national park because, according to the park ranger, BlackBerries did not work there, but AT&T and various others did. And I do think that's a result of ideology. You can picture a parallel universe in which AT&T, which was the service provider for telephony, had simply evolved into like the one universal service provider, for other things. I'm not necessarily advocating that.
Which it had been. Ma Bell, that's what Ma Bell was.
Yeah, and what you see now is, because this is a classic industry where you have scale effects, where the more nodes you add, the more efficient the network is. It wants to be a monopoly. I mean, that was the perception behind Theodore Vail, who, with the backing of J.P. Morgan, put together AT&T and permitted the federal government to treat it as a private but publicly regulated utility instead of a government monopoly. In most industrial countries, these things are just government monopolies. I mean, it makes no sense to try to artificially create a market in something like water or sewage, which is sort of a natural infrastructure monopoly. But that is an example of this kind of Jeffersonian ideology. There are many others, which I think kind of distort our policy.
As long as we're talking internet matters, I mean, there is a part of the internet story in America that I think you would highlight as closer to exemplary because it is Hamiltonian, which is to say that the government actually stepped in and established the standards that largely underpin the internet, right?
Yes, that's right. The National Institute of Standards and Technology plays an essential role in creating common standards for business. The government, there was some dispute about this. Gordon Krovitz in the Wall Street Journal the other day minimized the importance of the government creating the internet, but all of the experts agree it was essentially a spinoff of Defense Department related research. And what you find, interestingly, in one area after another, is that it takes the initiative of the public sector to compel for-profit firms to collaborate in order to create common standards, and also to share basic scientific breakthroughs and things. Because for quite practical reasons, if you're a company, you don't want to give out your trade secrets, and you actually don't want a level playing field. You want to press your advantages as far as you can. So creating common standards, that's a perfect example of what I'm calling a sort of Hamiltonian approach. It's not a matter of big government, big spending, and so on, but it's also not anti-business, because if you can create common standards, then you can create all sorts of new businesses.
Right. But you also favor some actual big spending, right? I mean, what are some things you'd like to see the government more involved in right now in a big way?
Well, we do have a deficit when it comes to infrastructure investment compared to the 1940s and 50s and 60s. I don't think that you can restore it involves both upgrading and maintaining existing things that like existing roads that are falling apart, but it also involves new deficit like natural gas pipelines going to ports that have been expanded to create these new giant container ships, which will be going through the Panama Canal, whose expansion will be complete in 2014. So there's all kinds of projects that need to be financed. The problem with our infrastructure deficit, our investment deficit, is that we try to do this through appropriations. The logical way to do it, and the way most state and local governments do it, is through bond finance. And to that end, I'm a supporter of the National Infrastructure Bank, which wants to use the federal government's ability to get low-interest loans to leverage private capital into infrastructure investment. My colleagues and I in the Economic Growth Program at the New America Foundation have built on that and suggested a national R&D bank. Because if you think about it, R&D that leads to basic science and technological breakthroughs that then become public property, that's exactly the kind of long-term investment that should be funded by borrowing, rather than just annual legislative appropriations.
But aren't we in an age where the benefits of research kind of very readily seep beyond our borders, which genuinely is different, I think, from 100 years ago, right, in terms of how fast it can happen?
Well, that's right. On the other hand, I think of it as the kind of the Capitol Police situation where I live near the White House, a couple of blocks away. For some reason, in all of these power outages over the last decade, it's never affected my neighborhood. Other neighborhoods of Northern Virginia and D.C. And of course, it's well known that if you live in a zone, at least back in the old Marion Barry days of Washington, when it was much more anarchical and lawless, if you lived in a neighborhood patrolled by the Capitol Police, then you benefited. Just as you were sort of a free rider. So I'm not persuaded by that argument. I do think it makes sense if you're a for-profit corporation that you're not going to engage in basic research because other companies can then profit from it. You can't capitalize on and recoup your costs. I don't think that applies to countries because even if the Chinese or the Europeans, then pick up on, the invention of nuclear energy or something, you're still better off from having done it. And you may have a temporary lead from having done it first, even if the technology diffuses.
Yeah, I hope you would, because otherwise it wouldn't seem to me, even if some benefit flows back from China, it wouldn't seem to me to make sense for American taxpayers to fund research that fundamentally spurs industry in China, right?
Well, but the problem is not the research, it's the connection between the research and the manufacturing. And that's another debate. I believe that the U.S., for national security reasons, as well as for economic reasons, needs to rebuild some, not all of its manufacturing capability, and that all major countries, regardless of what economic PhDs tell them, are going to want to be represented in the high value-added industries of their era, whether it was steamships a century ago or aerospace today. So I just take it for granted that all the major powers are going to be promoting manufacturing. The question is, can we work out a system of global rules and treaties so that we don't have this, ruthless beggar thy neighbor a system in which each country tries to corner as much of the global market for aerospace or computers or whatever as it can. That's the real danger to me. And saying, well, but even talking like that leads to protectionism. If the other industrial countries are doing this, if they're mercantilist, if they're boosting their own industries, then the United States, as powerful as it is, does not have the power by setting a good example to determine the rules of the world economy. The rules are going to be set by increasingly by the other major industrial nations, and we're going to have to adapt or die, as was the case for most of American history. The United States spent most of the 19th century trying to catch up to Britain, the first industrial power, and then it spent the first half of the 20th century engaged in a rivalry with Germany, which was a serious peer competitor, as they say nowadays at the Pentagon. So the period when we could just assume that our preferences will instantly translate into world order, I think that's coming to an end.
Yeah. Okay. So your history is truly kind of a dialectic. You're saying that there are these, there are these there's these bursts of Hamiltonian initiative that then are followed by a kind of a Jeffersonian backlash. You say that we are now deep into a Jeffersonian backlash, which you trace back to to Jimmy Carter. Does that account for the trouble we're in, per se?
Well, I think so, because if you look at all of the people talking about what do we do now with the crisis of the Great Recession in the short run, and then what do we do in the long term beyond that, assuming that we dig out of this. We're stuck in this kind of 1980s, 1990s mindset where what we do is we have more startups. We have more little tiny startup companies. And all again and again, most jobs, we have mass unemployment problem. Well, most jobs are created by small business. And the thing is, all of those are half-truths. Small business creates most jobs. It also destroys most jobs because most small businesses fail pretty rapidly. Very few of them survive any length of time. And
the successful some get really big, like Apple and Amazon and Microsoft. That happens.
Well, that's right. And but see, here again, we're the slaves of the 1980s and 1990s. What you see when you get waves of technological innovation. And I argue that there were these three industrial revolutions, the first based on the steam engine, the second based on the internal combustion engine and electricity in the 1860s and 1870s, and then the IT revolution, which the prehistory of it is the 30s and 40s and the early Cold War, but it really gets going with the 1980s and 1990s. Once you go from the basic development of a technology to the commercialization, there's a wave of startups, lots of little companies. If you go back to 1900, there were about 100 car companies, car startups, automobile manufacturing startups in the United States. By the 1930s, it's about a dozen. By the 1950s, it's the big three. This is natural because there are economies of scale. The little dinosaur, you have lots of little tiny dinosaurs hatch, and then you come back in 20 years, and there are a couple of big ones, and the rest have been eaten or crushed. I think we're now in the early mature phase of the IT revolution. It's kind of like where automobiles were in the 20s, not necessarily the 50s. And it's quite natural that we're seeing monopoly and oligopoly on the part of these survivors, the hatchlings that grew up, like Google, and the others like Dogpile and Inktomi just bit the dust. And that's perfectly natural. But because of this failure to see that there are patterns to the lifespans of particular technologies and industries. We see a lot of politicians and policy wonks using the number of startups as a measure of how innovative we are, which is just completely confusing, right? The question is, where are we in the technological cycle of the last great disruptive technology? That's not to say there may not be new, completely disruptive technologies, what are sometimes called general-purpose technologies. At this very moment, somebody may be creating flubber in some laboratory, but there's a time lag. So even if you create flubber today, it's going to take 10 or 15 years to work it out, and then it will take another generation maybe to start applying it to transform different areas of the economy. So the idea of life cycles, of product life cycles, of industrial life cycles, I think we have to take very seriously.
And you think we are in the mature phase of the IT revolution. Does that mean things are going to start actually slowing down in terms of innovation?
No, not on the contrary. I said early mature phase. So, for example, if you looked in the 1920s, you would have said, oh, well, the automobile age is here, right? The United States has more automobiles than any other country in the world, and we're driving around and so on. But the thing is, that would have been wrong, because we had not yet applied the internal combustion engine in the form of tractors and mechanized harvesters to revolutionize agriculture. All of that took place in the 30s and 40s. So then you would say in 1945, well, we were wrong in the 20s, but now finally the automobile revolution is over. Nothing else is going to happen. It's just going to slow down, stagnation, no more surprises. And then in the 50s and 60s, you get the cities empty out. You get the suburbs. You get stores, malls growing up at highway intersections. You get drive-in movies and drive-in restaurants. So I think we have to be very cautious about saying, okay, IT is over, now it's on to the next big thing, biotech or nanotech or whatever. There are entire areas of the economy where no one really has figured out how to use IT effectively to greatly increase productivity.
Yes, like my office, for example.
Well, I was going to use that example, but since you've used it, I'll have to use another one. The most notorious are higher education and healthcare, which are still organized as pre-modern, craft-based, individual credential-based sort of things. I mean, they're not even factories.
If I go to a new doctor, I have to write my whole history in by hand, and that's, so far as I can tell, that's all they have. I mean,
if you look at a hospital is not organized like a Henry Ford factory. It's organized like an 18th century, downtown bazaar, where each smith, that is, each medical professional, has a separate little stall in the public square, right? And then so each blacksmith is doing his own thing, and so even if the blacksmith's tools are advanced, you actually have to have someone like Henry Ford to come along and say, you can use electric motors to power conveyor belts to take pieces to individual workers who will also have power tools, right? Now, and it all becomes an integrated operation, and that's not the case yet with healthcare and with a lot of education.
But is the problem one of ingenuity, or is it partly things like privacy concerns? I assume maybe that's one reason there's no consolidated digitally stored version of my health history, which you'd think would be largely a good thing for doctors to have access to in certain situations, right? I mean, is it basically just a kind of failure to have the wisdom to use technology well, or
I think you're right. I think you're onto something. I think that this is part of this larger Jeffersonian backlash of the 1970s and 80s that goes on today, where there's this kind of paranoia about the sinister big. I mean, think about the way government officials were portrayed in 1950s science fiction movies. They were these wise, generals and engineers, and they're going to defeat the invading Martians, right? And then if you flash ahead to the X-Files, they're working with the Martians against us, right? So. I think if you look at the Progressive era or the New Deal or even the 50s and 60s, now, arguably they veered over into authoritarianism in some cases. But, for example, these, like having soldiers refusing to take vaccines and things like that. I mean, I just think there was the perception of the legitimacy of the public sector in overriding privacy concerns was much greater in the earlier Hamiltonian phase of the present republic than it has been since the Carter and Reagan years.
I see. So our failure to use technology wisely in healthcare winds up fitting smoothly into the grand scheme of your book and affirming your thesis.
Well, most facts do tend to affirm my views. Isn't it funny the way that works? It's very interesting. Yes.
Same thing with my theses. But that is interesting. So what are some ways that an enlightened Hamiltonian would turn things around right now, and see to it that the rest of the information technology age works out better than it would otherwise?
Well, I think historically the prestige of the government in the United States has been so low, and this is something that James Fallows pointed out years ago, that whenever we want the government to do the kinds of things that are done routinely by civilian governments in Western Europe or East Asia or elsewhere, in the United States we have to pretend it's for military defense. So just as a practical matter, I would put national defense in front of any policy that you want to do, whether it's justified by national defense or not. I'm not totally cynical. That is, in a world of rival great powers, having an advanced technological base, has military implications as well as civilian. But if you look, for example, at really what was our last great infrastructure build-out, it was the national highway system under Dwight Eisenhower. Actually, Franklin Roosevelt was really pushing for this all through his 4 terms. Eisenhower gets credit for it, rightly so, because he used his prestige as a general to say that we needed to complete the federal interstate highway system with federal funding for strategic reasons. And the bill was actually called, I think, the National Defense and Interstate Highway act. So every time you drive down a federally funded highway, realize that it was not built for you; it was built for tanks.
Tanks,
right? Going cross country. So, I think you can make a case that's not actually a cynical case. That is, you cannot be a great military power in the 21st century or the 22nd century unless you are a cutting-edge technology and science power. And the reason is the countries like the Soviet Union that have tried to have a separate military-industrial base, where you have a world-class military-industrial system, and then you have a crappy civilian industrial sector and domestic economy, well, they lost, right? Mm-hmm. The United States prevailed in the three world conflicts of the 20th century, World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, mainly because of the strength of its dual-use industrial economy, which could be used both for civilian and for military purposes. So I like to tell people that after we defeated the Soviet Union, we then turned into the Soviet Union. We're basically adopting the Soviet method, which is we have a totally separate, isolated, specialized defense industrial sector. And then we have this largely laissez-faire attitude towards whether we have any particular industries in this country or not. We're content to allow the Chinese government and CEOs of various U.S. multinationals to decide what factories we will have and what industries they'll be in. Now and then, under political pressure, Republican and Democratic presidents slap on a tariff or something, or they go to the World Trade Organization. But the idea that we would have an industrial strategy in the civilian sector is completely unheard of, even though it's perfectly legitimate in the defense industrial sector. So I would just say the whole economy is the defense base, which is literally true. I mean, that actually is the case. There are no great powers since the Industrial Revolution have begun that have not been at least competent industrial powers, and that includes relatively poor countries like the Soviet Union and Imperial Japan.
I'm curious as to how the financial collapse looks through your lenses. Does it make sense to look at what happened around 2008 through a kind of Jacksonian versus Hamiltonian lens?
Well, the way I look at it, and I set this forth in the parts of my book about what I call the Pax Americana, about the crumbling American hegemonic system, there are two explanations of this crisis, which are really quite distinct. One is that it was simply a crisis of the unregulated banking sector. And if we had had the right regulators in charge, or if Alan Greenspan had raised interest rates earlier, we never would have had these bubbles. The other explanation, which I think is far more accurate, sees this as a matter of global imbalances. And this is not a left-right thing. So, for example, the conservative FT columnist Martin Wolf goes along with the global imbalance theory, which is that the reason money was so cheap in countries like Britain and the United States and Spain, which had these stock and real estate bubbles, was that industrial exporting countries with export-led economic strategies like China, the most important, but also most of the East Asian countries, and also Germany within the Eurozone, were racking up huge amounts of dollars or other currency, which instead of recycling by buying the goods of their trading partners, as classic liberal free trade theory would suggest they would do, they instead bought debt, largely from the central banks of the countries with which they ran these perpetual trade surpluses. And that allowed those central banks to lend money at lower rates. And so you had these very low interest rates, which caused these huge speculative bubbles. And then when they collapse, we're stuck with the present system. So I know it's kind of complicated, but if you take that view, then the world economy is much more deeply messed up than the more optimistic view that, those bankers just ran amok. That is, it means that we really have to have entirely new models of growth. You cannot have a world economy divided between chronic trade deficit countries like the U.S. and Britain and Spain, which are borrowing money to finance their consumption of imports from the chronic trade surplus countries. The former surplus countries have to have a switch to a model of domestic demand-driven growth. They have to pay their people more so they can buy more of the goods they make. At the same time, you have to have some degree of reindustrialization in the trade deficit countries. I say some degree because in many industries, thanks to the government industrial policies of these surplus countries, there is a glut. That is, world industrial capacity has been overbuilt, and there's got to be a shakedown. Now, the question is whether it can be a coordinated shakedown where the Chinese agree to unbuild some of their overbuilt capacity and let us rebuild some of ours, or whether, as unfortunately seems more likely to me, this shakedown comes about as a result of 20 or 30 years
to me, I've got to say, but go ahead.
Of trade wars.
Yeah.
Just, bilateral trade war, which is the way it's happened in the past.
Yeah, I don't see real signs of that, do you?
There was a brief, glorious moment in 2009 where all of the major industrial countries agreed to reflate their economies with stimulus simultaneously. It was too good to last.
I remember that.
So immediately, they then go back to just doing the same thing they did before the crisis, only more so. So China goes back to building even more export capacity, instead of doing what it should have done, which is to shift towards domestic demand-led growth. The United States, for political reasons, is paralyzed. And so in the United States and Britain, essentially the consensus is for austerity, which would further contract demand in a quasi-depression caused by the contraction of demand. And as a British economist, I've forgotten his name, said during the Great Depression, he said, worrying about inflation in the middle of a depression is like crying, fire, fire, during Noah's flood. Mm-hmm. But on both sides of the equation of these global imbalances, the surplus countries and the deficit countries, the leaders are stuck in the previous paradigm, and they're really not thinking rationally about what needs to be done, both in the present crisis and also to rebuild what a certain author once called a non-zero world, if we get beyond this crisis.
Well, so is what we need more coordinated policy among nations in the fiscal and monetary and other realms?
Well, I'm a liberal internationalist, Hamiltonian than I am. I mean, you have to have a realist head, but my heart is certainly a liberal internationalist. And for most of the period of industrial civilization since the 18th century, we simply had one round of great power conflict and trade war after another. We could return to that. It would be in different forms, but it would essentially be each major industrial. Could be a different cast of characters. I mean, the Chinese and the Indians might be important in this round, not the Russians and the French or the British. But that's what we want to avoid. You and I spent most of our lives in the Cold War. And there's this strange nostalgia. I was a Cold War hawk, but I don't miss it. It was a terrible, terrible thing. It was a huge misallocation of resources on both sides. Most of the people who died in the Cold War were proxies of the U.S. and the Soviet Union. They were people in civil wars in Africa and Asia and Afghanistan, among other places. And the only reason those civil wars lasted was because both superpowers just kept them going. They would have ended otherwise. Indochina. For 30, 40 years. We could return to that. And most of the nightmare scenarios involve some kind of conventional conflict among great powers where we're bombing the Chinese over Taiwan or something, which seems quite unlikely. But the more likely scenario of a Cold War in which we go back to the old days of proxy wars and arms races and all of that would be a terrible tragedy for Americans and for the world as well. So I hope that we can work this out. Right now I think the American elite is still in this triumphalist post-Cold War mindset where we're just going to police the world. We're the Capitol Police. We're just going to unilaterally do it. The other major industrial countries, at some point, they'll give up their rival ambitions and be content to be like West Germany and Japan were during the Cold War, and they'll just make the cars, and we'll be the police, and we'll buy their cars, and they can lend us money to buy their cars. I think that system collapsed in 2008. And it's never going to be rebuilt. The U.S. is tapped out. That sort of system in which the U.S. is the main consumer of the world and also the main provider of unilateral military protection, I think is gone. The U.S. can provide the world's reserve currency for some time to come just because everywhere else is even scarier than we are. So the dollar will be a safe haven for some time.
What's the alternative source of international security? I mean, if the U.S. can't be the world's policeman, which I agree it can't, is it a kind of a spheres of influence system where you just admit that we can't afford to have a fleet in every ocean and let the major powers in those areas call the shots, or is it some sort of global governance thing, or what?
Well, this was the big challenge that exercised the minds of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson and Colonel House and Franklin Roosevelt. None of them, interestingly enough, imagined anything like the degree of U.S. hegemony that existed after World War II. So they assumed there would be a multipolar world. And the question was, well, okay, if you have multiple great powers, how do we avoid having a world war every generation? And the two answers were either spheres of influence, where we police our sphere in North America, they police theirs, which they rejected, at least as long as it looked as though the other spheres were going to be hostile, under Imperial Germany and Nazi Germany and also Imperial Japan. Now, they actually didn't deal with a case where you had, let's say, Angela Merkel having a sphere of influence over Europe. That just wasn't an option to their minds. So I wouldn't totally dismiss the sphere of influence option. But their main goal was to create what was called a concert of powers. And a concert of powers is a realist notion. It's not a airy-fairy, utopian notion at all. It assumes that these powers have interests, and the reason they team up with each other is because, like the heads of crime families in New York, they want to create a syndicate because the alternative to the syndicate is whacking each other. So it doesn't mean they like each other, but it means that they're trying to avert a world war, by cutting deals. And the difference between a concert of power and spheres of influence is that the great powers that belong to the concert, at least in some cases, I mean, there can be overlaps, have shared responsibilities in outside areas. So, for example, if the United States intervenes militarily, unilaterally in West Africa, then the Chinese might get suspicious about what the Americans are up to, and vice versa if China sends all these troops, like some civil war in West Africa. So the concert of power strategy says that, well, in that case, you should have a joint Sino-American force, not because they like and trust each other, but because they don't like and they don't trust each other. So it is a realist concept. And it's kind of a pessimistic one, but that's the best that these brilliant strategic thinkers have been able to come up with in order to have some kind of a peaceful world order, assuming genuine world federalism is unrealistic.
The UN Security Council was a realist concept in that sense. I mean, the General Assembly, the idea of the actual power in the UN residing in the Security Council and not the General Assembly was realist in much the same way, right?
Yes, that's right. And the original plan was even more realist, as I point out in another book of mine from 2006, The American Way of Strategy. I have a long section in there about how President Roosevelt, who was a realist, he had always been skeptical about Woodrow Wilson's, liberal utopianism, even though he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the Wilson administration. He was more like his cousin Theodore Roosevelt, and have a very hard-edged realist view of the world. He wanted the Security Council not even to be part of the United Nations in his early proposals. It would be an informal thing. It would simply be the wartime allies, the U.S., Britain, and the Soviet Union. He assumed Britain would continue to be a great power, and maybe with China under Chiang Kai-shek, if it became a great power, they would simply meet in summit meetings. It'd be purely informal. They'd have these little summit meetings, and they would run the world. And the UN, as FDR conceived of it, would just be kind of a talking shop. The UN in its present form owes its structure to his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, who, while FDR was engaged with other things like winning World War II and gradually dying of old age, so he sort of lost interest in the project, and then Cordell Hull tried to recreate the League of Nations. which arguably was a failure, and its reincarnation in the United Nations has been a failure because there's no way for this quasi-governmental structure to adapt to the changing distribution of power in the world, right? So every attempt to get Germany and Japan and India, which are clearly great powers in the 21st century, into the security. Is France a power of the first rank? No. Is Britain? No. But they're still on the Security Council.
So it ceases to be a realist. The Security Council gets less and less realist in the sense of less and less corresponding to the actual distribution of power in the world.
Yeah, and to my mind, that means that not just the League and the UN, but any attempt to try to codify the distribution of power in some kind of global governance institutions. And you see the same debate in things like the World Bank, right, and representations of weighted votes, things like that. Inevitably, there's going to be a gap between actual power and then the formal power, which reflects the actual power of 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. To my mind, I didn't approve of the Bush administration's actual policies, but this idea of shifting coalitions of the willing, they wouldn't have realized it, but it was actually very close to what FDR had in mind, as opposed to some very rigid alliances or intergovernmental world federalist structure.
Okay. Listen, we're running out of time, but I'd like to get back to domestic policy a little bit. What does your paradigm have to say about the income inequality problem? I mean, first of all, would you blame it more on Jeffersonians or Hamiltonians? And secondly, what do you do about it?
Well, it's been exacerbated in the United States by America-specific measures, so that while income inequality has grown in all industrial countries, it hasn't grown anywhere near as much, say, in Canada, which is a very similar society. And even though Canada and the U.S. presumably are subject to the same technological trends, the same global competition, and so on. So the progressives who argue that the difference is largely explained by domestic factors, the weakness of unions in the U.S., the erosion of the minimum wage, which affects wages above it as a floor, deregulation of a lot of industries, which when they were cartelized in the past, before deregulation, they were able to extract monopoly rents. Let's say the regulated transportation industry before it was deregulated under Carter and Reagan, and pass them on in the form of higher wages to workers. So there are some domestic things you can do. They go against the entire trend of the last 30 or 40 years, like increasing service sector unionization, for example, would do a lot. But in the long run, I do think, and this is where you're sort of looking into the more distant future, the people who say, well, in the long run, automation is the real challenge, to our social contract, to our system of wages and benefits. I agree with that because I think that we want to go back to this world of the 1950s, in which the high productivity industries like the automobile industry, the major industry in the U.S., also employed enormous numbers of people and paid them very well wages, and because they paid these auto workers these great wages, same is true in Germany, it's true in Sweden, it's true in Japan, when they went out and spent their paychecks, this sort of redistributed money through the private sector. I think if you end up in a world, and it's where we're going, where the highly productive sectors, like manufacturing and a lot of high-tech agriculture, and certainly mining, of which energy is a part, are very, very highly automated, employ very few people. They dispose of enormous amounts of capital, but they're capital-intensive, they're not labor-intensive. And the labor they have shed has gone naturally into sectors like home health care, where people are still preferable to robots, at least in the foreseeable future, and there's a demand for the labor. But on the other hand, even with some productivity growth, you're simply not going to get the kind of enormous gains of growth that you're getting in these largely automated production sectors. So then that raises the question, if the paycheck of the auto worker, if the production worker is no longer the mechanism of redistribution from the productive sector to the less productive sector, then government maybe has to play a role. Now, interestingly enough, conservatives, in spite of their abstract rhetoric, implicitly agree with this when they support the earned income tax credit and wage subsidies. And even Mitt Romney, somewhere earlier, said he was open to the idea of wage subsidies. Well, wage subsidies are essentially taxing the economy as a whole, and then you're transferring income to low-wage workers, most of which are in this unproductive service sector, less productive. It's not that the jobs they're doing are unimportant. I'm simply using productivity in the narrow technological sense.
So you think the lion's share of the solution may be income redistribution orchestrated by the government?
Yes, and I think that the great debate of the next half century or century will be whether this should be done through wage subsidies and also through vouchers to purchase particular goods, being the two major forms of redistribution that have won bipartisan support in the last 20 or 30 years. I think there are real problems with that in a lot of cases. It's inefficient. It stimulates cost inflation in things like healthcare and in higher ed. And I think we need to reconsider other options, which include expanded public employment. I'm not talking about stimulus here. I'm not talking about, building roads to get us out of the recession. But I mean just permanent expansion of public employment for relatively low-skilled people, many of whom could do a lot of jobs, let's say universal pre-K. I don't want to say that teachers are not necessarily skilled, but the point is there's going to be a lot of elder care tasks, for example, and there seems to be an inexhaustible appetite for childcare that's not satisfied. They can be done by people. They could be paid employees of probably mostly state and local governments, maybe with federal subsidies, rather than poor private nannies who are the working poor and are getting paid off the side without Social Security benefits or even the minimum wage. So, but I think that's the debate. It's not going to be will there be government redistribution?
What about the problem that I think afflicts any of these solutions? Or may that wind up helping low-income people, which is just the current distribution of political power, right? I mean, and I would say that in the wake of the Citizens United case, that's going to be concentrated at least as highly as ever in the hands of relatively affluent people, right? So what are the political prospects for any of these solutions, ranging from empowering service sector unions to government-orchestrated redistribution of income?
Well, Herbert Stein of the American Enterprise Institute, the late economist, had what he called Stein's Law. Are you familiar with that?
No.
It's the one law of social science that is true in all times and all conditions. And Stein's Law is if a trend cannot continue forever, it stops.
Yeah. I have heard that.
This trend towards the concentration of inequality is... granted, it goes back to the 70s and 80s, but real public awareness of it, I would say, what would you say? I think it's maybe 5 years old, maybe 10 years old. It has moved from being something that only radical progressives talked about to the Occupy Wall Street.
That's true.
Within a fairly small number of years. Right?
So you're saying it may increasingly be a concern of relatively affluent people who weren't even in on the conversation about it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And here's the thing is, I think you get a kind of a three-way split between reactionaries who just want the status quo that benefits their privileges. You see this again and again in history. You have the reactionaries. You have the demagogues. Huey P. Long, William Jennings Bryan. You're going to just every man a king. We're just going to assault the plutocrats. We're going to burn down the bakery, because there's not enough bread. And the role of the reformers, including conservative reformers as well as progressive reformers, is at the end of the day, they go to much of the elite and they say, look, it's a choice between Roosevelt and Huey P. Long, right? If you don't like William Jennings Bryan, if he scares you, then Governor Woodrow Wilson of New Jersey, maybe you should back him. Because at the end of the day, your reactionary stand-pat position is going to fail in any democracy, even in non-democracies, because you have military coups and things like that. So I'm not at all worried that we will, be tools of the plutocracy and this kind of, you remember that movie Rollerball, right? Where all the corporations were
vaguely, James Caan and somebody.
Right. But in that movie, the corporations just ran everything and everybody's just pawns of the rich. No society like that would last. more than a generation or two. What I do worry about is having some modern version of Huey P. Long or Hugo Chavez or someone like that, because the reforms have been thwarted. And I can tell you, as a Texan, where the progressive tradition was always quite weak, and you had demagogic populists versus reactionary oligarchs. That was essentially the two parties. This is not a good situation, right? Where you have to choose between the demagogue and the aristocrat.
So you're saying an enlightened upper class would be concerned with and do something about income inequality if it understands the future scenarios that otherwise are implied.
Yeah, and I just think they're not scared enough yet. I
we
think
should scare them.
Part of the problem is that much of the American establishment, I include a lot of Democrats as well as Republicans, they really think that there's something called a recovery, and that we're going to recover and go back to the system the way it was in 2008 with slight modifications. And I've got news for them. We're never going back. The pre-2008 world, that is gone. The world that emerges from this is going to be a new system. Could be better, could be worse, but it's going to be as different from the world that we're familiar with before 2008 as the 1950s and 60s were from the 19-teens and 20s. But I don't think that most Americans, and certainly not most opinion leaders and politicians, have wrapped their mind around this yet. I think that we're still in this mindset as in 1930 or early 1931, where, the Depression's almost over, housing starts are looking up, we're going to get back to business as usual pre-crash. And I just don't think that's going to happen. I think we're in the early years of a generation-long crisis here and in other countries around the world. And the global system, as well as the American system that emerges, is going to be unrecognizably different in lots of ways. So at this point in history, outside-of-the-box thinking really is welcome. Because one thing we do know is we're not going back to the system.
I know one place people can find outside-the-box thinking, Michael Lind. I'm holding up your book right now. It's in the book Land of Promise. Thanks for sharing this hour with us, and continued good luck at the New America Foundation and in starting whatever future think tanks you have in mind.
Okay. Thanks, Bob. Appreciate it.
Okay. Take care, Mike.